cereal box or whatever, X number of calories and X number of this, X number of that, so that it's not hard to track these, right? So what packages, what versions, where's the code, what license, where you're using it, what physical machines, all kinds of things like that, and then a trail of who approved it. So that doesn't sound very lightweight, does it? However, if you have some tooling to help you, and you can start with even a couple of these, like what is it, what's the license, and where are we using it, think of picking a few of those maybe that are good starting points. The easiest then way, once you start tracking this, would be to conduct sort of a very high-level scan or audit of your code base. So, let's tell, in the policy, let's state, we want to know simply what open source we're using, and let's limit it to packages and licenses and our list of obligations for our developers and any conflicts we see. So you can do this with tools, you could do it with developers. You could look at the code, and if you have a lot of code, that's going to be a little difficult to do, right, and a little difficult to follow. Or you can, I think Bob mentioned OpenLogic, he mentioned Black Duck, Palamita. There's multiple tool vendors out there that can help you do some of that from a services perspective. All right, one of the other things in the policy, conducting a scan or conducting an audit. So just a couple, I guess, questions for you to think about in your policy. How many people are distributing software? I mean, if you're using open source, is it going out the door? So yours is going out the door, yours is going out the door. Anybody else is going out, or is it out? All right, so if you're distributing, there are obligations, and so this helps you get a listing of what you have in and what the licenses are, so you know what you have to do. If you're not, if it's only going internally, you still need to understand the obligations of the license. Anybody heard the words free as in free speech, not free as in free beer, as it relates to open source? All right, so it's probably the most famous saying out there. Well, one of the obligations, there is a license, and you're obligated to do certain things under the license. It doesn't cost you anything for it, but it doesn't mean you have no obligation. So developers typically don't, no offense to any developer in the room, typically when you click the accept button and you're downloading it, that doesn't really click. You're like, okay, what does that mean as a developer? No, it's you as your business, right? So you got to understand your obligations, even if you're deploying internally. One of the other key components of an open source policy that we have typically seen is you have to have commercial support and indemnification. I don't know if that's one other thing to consider in your supportability, but if you don't know where and what's in your code, then you won't know what you have to have support on. So when developer X leaves to take a new job, works on a new product, you're not going to have anybody to call if something happens. So scanning, I think, makes a lot of sense. Self-reporting, I don't really matter whose scanner you use, but self-reporting, I can just tell you from our experience, is just simply not accurate. The self-declaration just doesn't work, only because not everybody reports. You have bundled software, and people leave and they forget from projects. So maybe a way to think about starting your policy, a best practice might be to start small. You heard, I think, Worley mention the culture thing. Start with a small project, start with a small team. Do the same thing here in a policy. Take a general policy, find a small project, maybe you got the next release of your project, you'll say, okay, well, we're going to do these, here's our general policy, let's implement a few of those on the next release and let's try it out. Let's see how it works. Let's look for OSRB, Open Source Review Board volunteers, and a couple of people to sort of follow us and test the policy. So start small, and I'd suggest coming up with a baseline of an app, especially if this is something that you use on a regular basis. It's a fixed application. It's either going to go live on this date or we're going to ship it on this date. Because once you baseline it, it's very easy to stay. It's like a daily build concept, right? Any software developers in here? Anybody ever heard of the concept of the daily build, right? So what's the big benefit of the daily build? There's only like 1 day increment where anything can go wrong. You break the build, same concept here. Get it baselined and then scan and sort of incremental points and scan it multiple times during your your life cycle. So start somewhere, I guess, is my advice to you. And then you are going to have to remediate. I can just sort of tell you that based on the scan results. So you're going to find something and you're going to go, holy BGs, what is that we found? So you're going to have to take a look at it. And based on what you found, then you can make the determination, is that a big deal? Do we really care about stuff that's out there before? Do we really care that there's something already in the field? Do we really care there's an application already in production? And you can determine, ask yourself some of these questions and determine, do we need to go back perhaps and remediate an application that's already out the door? And I guess the reason I share that with you is I would not let remediation scare you from starting. I mean, if you think the problem is a little scary now, it'll just be worse in another year or two because you're continuing to build and develop software. A couple of other comments just about compliance. Scanning is really just the first step. How many of you mentioned your government business? Are your legal teams involved in this process yet at all? All right, so I got a no, I got a yes, experience-wise, you're gonna go back and forth, right? You're gonna have, well, we got this, and your legal person is gonna go, ooh, we can't have that. Well, could we live with this? Well, maybe we could live with it. It's a process, I guess, is the point. And if you don't have someone on your legal team who understands open source licensing, you have really two options. One, you can try to extend their knowledge, or two, you can use another counsel. There are firms out there who specialize in open source licensing, and you can get their opinions on a contract basis. So you don't have to have this expertise necessarily in-house, but you do need to find it. I can tell you on an unrelated topic, but contracts. So 6 years ago when we started selling to enterprise customers and governments, everybody in procurement looked at our contract through the lens of proprietary software. Right? There are certain things that you go through in procurement that they're used to getting from proprietary vendors. One's unlimited indemnification, and they just didn't get the concept that if they got Apache from us, they wanted me to grant them the license to Apache. They wanted me to grant them indemnification on Apache, and I had to tell the legal people, I'm not even granting you the right to use Apache. That's what you do in the Apache licenser. And that whole concept was just, wow, it's out there. So if your legal people aren't already starting to get involved in this, you're going to have to get them up to speed or seek outside counsel. And you may end up changing some of your own EULAs just to reflect this, some of your end user license agreements. If you're an ISV, maybe it's probably the only one who might have that if you're the only one shipping software. All right, so the last thing related to being a good corporate citizen, so developing your policy, tracking your usage, scanning your code, getting yourself and being familiar with the licenses, getting yourself a compliance checklist. So once your policy is in place, and you will make some statements like, we like these kinds of licenses, we like these kinds of projects. This checklist will naturally flow from that because the obligations that are in the license, they're listed pretty, you must make the source code available. You must have an attribution. You must do these 10 things, right? That can be distilled into a checklist. You have to put a notice in the code. You got to put a notice in the documentation. One of my favorite examples of a license that our business friends don't like is called the beer license. There literally is a beer license that is approved by the OSI, and that beer license says, if you ever see me at a trade show, you have to buy me a beer. And I'm not making that up. And the reason that corporate customers don't like it is not because they think it's unreasonable, but here's what they said. Well, we can't ensure we've enforced that. How would we know? So it's the enforceability question, right? Yeah, do you have receipts? So the compliance checklist wouldn't necessarily reflect that, right? But there are certain things it's going to reflect. And the other thing it will force you to do is when you write them down on paper, you're going to go, oh, we cannot, our organization just simply can't do that. Now, we have had success, by the way, asking for projects to be licensed under a different license. That has worked for us. We have asked probably 24 projects if they would license us this code under a license that we could live with. And I've never gotten really a negative answer. Most of the time I get questions. Well, why do you want to do that? And what would it mean to us? Those kinds of things. But the communities are, maybe I shouldn't say this surprisingly, the communities are very helpful and engaging, the ones that are active, because they're really concerned. What is the community's number one concern? Like the viability and the vibrancy of their project and the adoption of their project. So if you are helping them get their project adopted, going to be a user, sort of viably using and building on the project, they'll work with you in more ways than you think. So if you haven't ever approached the community, don't be afraid to. They're actually quite great to work with. In fact, we have community members right up here.
Well, the question that comes to mind is, how does one change one's license if you're in that kind of project?
That's probably
For
a...
instance, if you decide you don't like the GPL and you want something different.
Well, you can license it under a dual license mode. You can re-release it under another license, right? So that's probably what time have we? Oh yeah, that's probably more than, maybe that's an off the record conversation, but that'll take another 30 minutes.